Hello, everybody. It is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Sara Kuebbing. We dressed as twins for this talk. She's currently an assistant professor at Yale University and the director of the Yale Applied Science Synthesis Program. which is an initiative that brings together scientists, practitioners, and policymakers to develop science that directly informs sustainability, land management, and conservation action decisions. So Sara is a plant community ecologist, and I want to say a conservation biologist, but also an ecosystem ecologist, am I allowed to? Whose work focuses on how invasive species and other global change drivers reshape ecosystems, and crucially, how science can inform more effective management and management responses. So what I particularly like about Sara, and what I'd like to tell you today, is that Sara's sort of been on this quest for a long time. Before she started graduate school, she had worked as a manager, like a land manager, and I'm just gonna tell the story, and then you're gonna have to pretend like it's right if it's not. Okay, so she worked as a land manager, and one of the things that was really interesting to her was that she had all these invasive species, and she didn't really know how to control them. And she looked at the literature and was super frustrated by the fact that there just wasn't enough information for her to make informed decisions to manage the land that she was managing. And so she decided to go to graduate school to think about how invasive species interact with one another to affect how they move and grow and thrive in the landscape. So after her PhD, which was on that, she got a very prestigious postdoc, a Smith Fellowship, to continue thinking about how we can have better management of invasive species. After her Smith Fellowship, she was recruited to the University of Pittsburgh and was an assistant and associate professor there, working on similar sorts of questions. And then she decided that maybe she needed a little bit more of the applied part of her life. And so she went back to Yale and started working in this group, which is really thinking about how can we better manage for carbon across landscapes. So she works with people from all around the world, thinking and from industry and I don't know, tech bros? Yeah. To think about how can we manage ecosystems to be for carbon. And recently, within the last 6 months, she decided to go back to academia and think a little bit more about invasive species and the role they play in carbon cycling and other things. And so she's now a professor at Yale. I'm thrilled to introduce Sara. She's also an early career fellow at the Ecological Society of America. She's a total rock star and an absolutely delightful person. So I'm excited for her talk. Oh, you have one.
Yep. Awesome. All right. Well, thank you for that very kind introduction, Amy. And it was 100% correct, so good job. So thanks to all of you for being here. It's been really nice to get to meet all the wonderful students and faculty, and looking forward to continued discussion. So thanks everyone for showing up here. And yeah, I'm going to sort of talk a little bit about my career arc and also some of the projects that I'm really excited about restarting and also diving into. But I just want to start by sharing some of my motivations and approach to research, which really does align with what Amy just said, which really center on these two complementary pillars. The first is building out ecological theory, and I do this using field and lab experiments and data synthesis and modeling to uncover the mechanisms that are driving forest responses to disturbance, to things like invasion and climate change. And I do this work because I think it's really interesting about how species interact with one another in their environment, and because it will reveal what species can or will grow both now but in the future in response to all of these disturbances. But the other thing that I find is really important, both just for sustaining and fulfilling me, but also informing my research, is engaging with management and policy. And so going out and working with people who are making policy decisions or making funding decisions or actually on the ground managing forests or other ecosystems. And so I do that through collaborating with groups like invasive plant councils, land managers, and management organizations like the Society of American Foresters. And these connections really help me understand what information practitioners need. They help me identify real-world research sites, and they help me, I hope even more, embed my science into active forest and ecosystem management projects, which really aligns those realisms. And I think importantly that working in both these areas really strengthens each of the other pillars of doing the engagement with the practitioners and policy, but then coming back and doing the mechanistic and basic research to build out the ecological theory. And so today I'm just going to share a few examples of how these guiding pillars have sort of shaped some of the key questions that I'm asking and interested in. But before I dive in, this is like not even complete, and actually Nate and Amy should both still be on here, even though I'm not sharing any work from Tennessee because of how important they've been in my research trajectory. But of course, this work was not done by me. It was done by a fantastic team of students, a lot at the University of Pittsburgh and some newer students at Yale University and postdocs that have been working with me. So I've just shared my motivation and approach to research, and next I want to provide a framework for conceptualizing sort of forest resilience, because a lot of what I'm doing right now is actually thinking about how resilient are our forests to these different global change drivers like introduction of invasive species, and now more and more of my work I've finally been sort of forced into thinking about climate change, which I would honestly rather not think about because of how scary it is, and the interaction between those two. And so I just want to talk about a little bit about how I think about forest resilience and how it links into my work, and then talk about these 3 core research questions that I'm pursuing and hoping to pursue as I transition into this assistant professor role. So if we're thinking about forest resilience, we really think it's essential because forests do a lot of things for us. They protect biodiversity, they provide important ecosystem functions like cleaning air and water, and they of course provide economic resources for a lot of rural communities that are using them for their livelihoods. And so this is why most major international policy initiatives focus on protecting and managing forest ecosystems for resiliency. So we have groups like the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity for Ecosystem Services, which is really worried about controlling invasive species for the protection of biodiversity, among other threats to biodiversity. We, of course, have groups like the IPCC that are really worried about climate change and using forests as both a mitigation and adaptation tool for dealing with currently changing and coming changing climates. And so, but if this is to talk about resilience, it's nice to start with the definition. And so what is resilience? So we can look to the IPCC, and they say resilience is the capacity of an environmental system to cope with a hazardous event or trend or disturbance, responding or reorganizing in ways that maintain their essential function, identity, and structure. And so we can really sort of break this down into sort of a cartoonish or conceptual figure of what this means. And so here on the y-axis, we have a response variable that we might care about. Maybe it's something like biodiversity. Maybe it's some ecosystem function like carbon storage or seedling recruitment or net primary productivity in a forest. But something that we care about that we want to manage. And then on the x-axis, we have time. And so a forest is generally considered resilient, or any ecosystem, when after a disturbance, like an invasion by a non-native species or a climate-related weather event, like a drought or a wind throw, if that function returns back to its steady state, to the original level that it was at. And so when we do find resilience, it's actually really useful information for land managers, because what it suggests is that the current composition of the forest can withstand these disturbances. And it means we might not need to manage or intervene in those systems. But in contrast, and what we're more and more concerned about with these like compounding global change factors, is that our forests or our ecosystems might not be resilient. They might be unresilient, and we might even call them degraded. Being after a disturbance event, that metric that we're really worried about doesn't actually return back to the level at which before the disturbance. And when these systems aren't resilient, it then becomes really important for us to understand why they're not resilient. What are the ecological mechanisms that are limiting that recovery? And then we might be able to then prescribe management tools to say, what can we do to alleviate or help these systems recover post-disturbance? And so that's what my current research that I'm going to share with you today, of some of these disturbances and how we're seeing not resiliency in the forest, but maybe we can understand the mechanisms to manage them to be resilient to the future. And yeah, so once we understand that why, we might be able to implement a management response and move it into a more restored forest state. And so coming back to this definition, we can see sort of 2 important things. Like one, if we're studying forest resilience, we need to think about disturbances and what are the important disturbances that we're going to see. And the other is identifying these like key essential functions, identities, or structures that we as humans care about. And so the two disturbances that I focus on in my research that I'm going to talk about today is first the accumulation of non-native invasive plants, and then second, the interactions between these invasions and changing climates, including things like the rising temperatures, droughts, or other extreme weather events. And some of the main response metrics that I really find interesting and important are things like native plant diversity in the forest, and then more recently my work has really been focused on understanding forest carbon stocks as this like carbon reservoir for climate mitigation. And so moving on to my first core research question, why do forests lack resilience to accumulating invasive plant species? And as Amy said in the introduction, this has really been like at the heart of some interest like since I was managing invasive plants for the Nature Conservancy way back in the day with Vermont, of like why do we just see all these non-native species in our forests and on the landscape? And so one key fact to know is that temperate eastern deciduous forests of North America are hotspots for non-native invasive plant species. And so we can see this from this map, the Global Naturalized Alien Flora database put together by Mark Van Clunen and colleagues, which is just number of naturalized species that we have in records. And you can see the eastern United States is bright red. We have like a disproportionate amount. And so this is where I've spent most of my time in my training. So I also have this sort of biased view of these like really intense invasions in these specific forest ecosystems. And these introduced non-native species are moving into our forest ecosystems. And so we can see that here really clearly from these two photos. The one on the left is taken nearby where I live in Connecticut. The other one on the right is taken actually near my in-laws' house in Wilmington, Delaware. But in both images, all you can see, all the green that you can see in these images are non-native invasive plants. So we can see just a huge proportion of that forest understory is built up with invasive plant biomass. And when I refer to invasive plants, I'm talking about species like this, ones that were introduced by humans. A lot of these species were actually introduced both either by early European colonists who brought things over from Western Europe as like part of their cultural reinstation here. And then the USDA actually helped introduce a lot of these plants that we see in our forest as well as a mechanism for introducing really important viable species. And so some of these are actually thanks to our own government around the time of the right post-Civil War. And most of these plants that are labeled invasive are also known to have ecological impacts, like reducing native diversity, changing hydrological cycles, changing fire cycles, changing nutrient cycles within forest. And so we know that the smattering of invasive plants that we see can have a really big impact on these ecosystems. And so one of the main reasons, which Amy has also already kindly introduced, that I became interested in the accumulation of invasive plants is because it was a major issue in one of my first jobs after I graduated from undergraduate working with the Nature Conservancy of Vermont. And so as forest stewards with the Nature Conservancy, we spent a lot of time basically going out in the forest and physically removing invasive plants from the forest. Because we knew that one of the key things that we cared about at the Nature Conservancy, which was biodiversity, was not recovering post-invasion. And so we thought if we remove this invasive plant material, we would then see a rebound in native diversity. And so what we found, though, was a lot of times after we removed the invasive plant, that didn't happen. And so that really spurred me to go back to school to try to understand, well, how can we study why we're not seeing this like rebound of native diversity in these systems when we're removing the species that we find problematic. But so this is another thing. So yeah, so in this job, we saw a lot of times when we removed, these are some field plots in Connecticut where you can actually track and see that what we saw happening was when we removed invasive plant species like this invasive stilt grass in the upper left-hand corner, if we track what happens, even in these like small meter squared plots, not even across a forest, we can clearly see that other invasive plants like the subdominant invader, Asiatic bittersweet, became really common. And so I kept seeing this over and over again, both in experiments and in my job. And so to manage this effectively, we really have to understand why are we seeing this accumulation of invaders? Why aren't we seeing the native plant communities responding? Why are we seeing new invaders move in even when we remove that dominant invader? And so when I returned to graduate school after the stewardship position, one of the first things I wanted to see is whether what I was observing in Vermont, this like accumulation of invasive species, was happening elsewhere. And so what I found is it's becoming increasingly clear that this actually isn't just an issue for the northeastern United States, but it's global. And so this is data taken from the Nature Conservancy's Conservation Projects database. And what you can find is if you look at conservation projects that the Nature Conservancy at the time were working on, which is that in conservation habitats, that black bar in panel B on the right, about 3/4 of the time when invasive forest managers were dealing with invasive species, they reported dealing with multiple invasive species in their habitat. But then if we go, at the time when I looked at the literature of what the literature was studying, I saw really clearly that in the literature we were only ever studying the impacts of single invasive species. And then very rarely, even when the literature was considering multiple invasive species, that little blue bar over on the right, very few of the literature studies were studying how these invasive species were interacting with one another. And so this mismatch really highlighted a knowledge gap for me that I continue to be interested in studying about how these invasive species are interacting with one another, with native species, and then how those interactions might shape what happens in outcomes moving forward. And so here's another example of another system that is filled with invasive species. This is comes from riparian forests. We find them really common in the mid-Atlantic and up in Connecticut, where we can see these 3 common invaders. And so the brown thatch that you see is all last year's Japanese stilt grass that died from last year. It's an annual grass, and it'll start emerging a little bit later. This is taken from the very early spring. That mat of green that you see with the pretty yellow flowers is a spring ephemeral, but it's non-native from Europe, called Lesser Celandine or Ficaria verna. And then tucked in between these mat of plants, we have garlic mustard, which is a really widespread forest invader. That's a biennial, and those are the little rosettes that are going to pop up in about another month or so from when this picture was taken. And it's really common when you walk in riparian forests, especially in the mid-Atlantic United States, to see these 3 invaders co-occurring with one another, like all on top of one another. And so it's a good question of like, why is this happening? And so it's interesting to me that research rarely looks at how invasive plants are interacting with one another, because there's so many hypotheses in invasion ecology and community ecology about interactions and how that feeds invasion. And so, for example, there's like a lot of slew of hypotheses that sort of say, well, the reason that we see so many invasive species is because they're hyper competitive, so they can outcompete all these native species. There's these negative interactions, competitive interactions with these native species, and that's why they're so dominant. But we actually haven't thought as much about what's going on when invasives interact with one another. And we actually only have one hypothesis that people keep returning to, which is this idea of invasional meltdown, that perhaps the reason that we see the accumulation of invasive species is because these species are facilitating one another. So they must be helping each other out, and that's why we see them accumulate in the ecosystem. And so I was interested in exploring this and looking across studies to see how common it was for plant-plant interactions to show these positive facilitations. And so we might hypothesize that one reason we see multiple invasive plants in plant communities is because these invasive plants are facilitating one another. And so we can test that using a meta-analysis of studies that actually measure plant-plant interactions and competition together. And so before I show you the data from this study, I'll just walk you through the graph. On the y-axis, we just have the relative effect of another species. So that's the relative effect of something like plant growth, maybe a fitness metric, but usually plant growth or biomass when it's growing by itself compared to when it's growing with another species. And positive effects are going to show a facilitative interaction, and negative effects are going to show a competitive interaction. And so if invasional meltdown, or this like facilitation, was really common, we may expect to see findings that look something like this. So if non-native plants are facilitating other non-native plants, like you see in the blue dot, we would see some sort of positive facilitative effect. And if non-native plants are competing and outcompeting with native plants, then we should expect to see, on average, a negative effect with competition. But what do we actually see when we look at the data? And so these meta-analysis results come from over 1,200 observations of plant interactions and include a total of 274 plant species found in 21 different ecosystems across the globe. And so in terms of competitive effects of non-native plants, we find exactly what we expect to see, this strong negative of plant. When a native plant is growing with a non-native plant, we tend to find competitive effects. That's been found in a lot of other meta-analyses. But we don't find this strong facilitative interaction when we look at the literature that's studying the impacts of non-native plants on other non-native plants. We don't see these like widespread positive interactions that might be explaining this invader accumulation in ecosystems. And so if non-native plants are competing with one another, then why are we finding so many ecosystems with so many invaders? And one possibility might be that there's actually asymmetry in the strength of the competitive interactions among many plants in the community. So if you look at these two dots, they are both negative, but I've actually blown up the effect size dots, so it makes it a little harder to see. The effect of a non-native plant on a native plant is on average 2 times greater than the effect of a non-native on another non-native, right? So there's this asymmetry. So it's not great to have another non-native plant as your competitor, but it's worse off on average if you are a native plant species. Furthermore, if we start then thinking about communities that are more than just 2 species, because we do a lot of 2 species interaction studies in the lab or in the greenhouse, but that's not actually what's occurring in nature, we actually see stronger asymmetries. So if we look at like the relative competitive effects of a native plant on another native plant, we see that it's negative, but it's not as negative as the impact of that non-native plant on a native plant. And then I think the most interesting result that we found from this meta-analysis is when we look at the competitive effects of natives on other non-natives, we see this neutral effect. Sometimes it's negative, sometimes it's positive, but on average, native plants are not really competing or having a competitive effect on these non-natives. And so we have all these asymmetrical competitive interactions happening within ecosystems that could possibly be explaining why we're seeing invader accumulation, not because of direct facilitation, but just because of those different interactions. And so for me, this scenario was really exciting to find, because when we find that these strengths of interactions, we can start seeing cool effects like indirect interactions among different species, which as community ecologists in the room, hopefully you find that exciting as well. And so from this observation and meta-analysis, I was really interested in testing these ideas directly. And so leaving the idea of like, could we find indirect facilitation, whether direct pairwise competition will decrease with increasing numbers of competing species. So if that would be a sign of indirect facilitation, if we find that as we add species in the system, those competitive effects start to decrease through time. And so my former lab group at the University of Pittsburgh tested these ideas using these 3 invasive species as a model system to start testing these ideas. And so this work was led by Rachel Reeb, who was a PhD student in my lab at the time, who really led all of this greenhouse work. And as you can see, relics of the pandemic when only 1 person was allowed in the greenhouse at a time. So she did a lot of work on this on her own in the greenhouse. And so we grew these 3 species either in single species pots, 2 species pots, or 3 species mixtures, and we measured their growth in response to these competition treatments. And then we used mixed effects models. We estimated that relative effect of pairwise competition on each species' total biomass to test this hypothesis of whether, as we increase the number of species in these pots, we saw a reduction in competitive effects. And so in this graph, what I'm showing you here is on the y-axis, the relative effect of another species, where again, positive is going to mean facilitative effects, competitive is going to be negative effects. And then each panel is for each of our 3 species that we had in the experiment. And so what we found when we looked at the direct additive pairwise effects was that 2 of our invaders, our garlic mustard and our stiltgrass, grew less when they were in competition with other invasives. And we also found this funny thing where the celandine was actually facilitated, meaning the celandine did worse when it grew with other celandine plants relative than when it grew with a garlic mustard or stiltgrass. And I'm going to come back to that in 1 second about why that might be. But first, did we find what we thought we might find, which is a reduction in competitive effects once we went into those 3 species mixtures? And the answer to that was yes. We found that for some of our species. And so you can see for stiltgrass, when we look at the net effect of 3 species on competitive interactions, we see that those competitive interactions for stiltgrass were alleviated when there were 3 species in the pot relative to when it was just stiltgrass and garlic mustard, the other species in the pot. So these are some fun findings, but there's one other fact that I haven't told you about these species that provides a little bit more insight as to why we saw these facilitative effects with celandine, and also why we didn't see much of a change for garlic mustard in terms of its competitive effect between 2 and 3 species mixtures. And so one reason we chose these 3 species was not just because they really commonly co-occur, but they also do this really interesting and notable pattern where they are actually separating their phenology in time. So the timing in which these plants emerge in the spring and flower and fruit are very different across the season. And so you can see here from the pictures up above, celandine is that early spring ephemeral. It's emerging really early in the spring. It's going to flower sometime in like late March, early April, and then it's going to die back. Then our garlic mustard is going to come up and bolt, and then way at the tail end of the season, our stilt grass is actually going to reach peak biomass sometime in late August or September. It's going to flower and put seeds out. And so these plants are naturally separating themselves in time in terms of their flowering, which means they're actually potentially naturally reducing their competitive effects on one another. And so Rachel was really interested in this, and so we also added to this experiment a phenological separation treatment where we either planted all the plants in the greenhouse at the same time, as if they didn't have that phenological separation through time, or we added them at about 4-week intervals, so just like we would see in nature, where the celandine would come up first, followed by the garlic mustard, and then followed by the stilt grass. And we used that to test how much was phenological separation also explaining some of the patterns of co-occurrence that we saw with these plants. And so by doing this, by smushing all the phenological separation together, we see a really clear signal that celandine, that early spring ephemeral, actually is just benefiting from these early season effects. It's just getting out earlier and doing its thing before everyone else comes out. But then when we grow them at the same time, it, like the other species, have a really strong competitive effect. And so we see these other cool ecological mechanisms happening where these invasive plants are probably being sorted a little bit by who's there, where they're able to mitigate competitive effects among one another. But we also see that even when we remove phenological separation for these other species, we can still see signs of those indirect facilitative effects for plants like stilt grass, where it still does better when there's a third species in the pot relative to when there's a second species in the pot. And so I think these results are really exciting because it now starts telling us why we might see patterns of removing dominant invasive species and being replaced by subdominant invaders, because they're less competitive than the dominant invader, and they're probably using lots of different cool ecological mechanisms to separate themselves, but they're still more dominant than the native species. And so this is a really good example why I think understanding these sort of like nitty-gritty ecological mechanisms, like how species compete with one another, is really important, because it can help explain why our management sometimes falls short, and also maybe suggesting what we could do, which is reintroducing native propagules or managing for a wider spectrum of invasive species in the forest when we go in and do these vegetation removal treatments. And so I hope I provided you some compelling evidence that forests can lack resilience to these accumulating invasive species because of the interactions among invasive species can shift these net community dynamics. One thing I'm really interested in doing is expanding, because again, we don't see 3 species that much in nature, is expanding some of these studies out to get into even larger communities out in nature, where we can start directly also measuring some of these native species that we see to see if we see these same indirect interactions among natives and these co-occurring invaders. So now I want to shift gears to one of my next core research questions that I started at the University of Pittsburgh, which is thinking not just about invasion, but also climate warming and climate change, and so whether forest biodiversity is resilient to both warming and invasion. And this is a growing focus of my work, and it's in part because I spend a lot of time in forest, and unlike tropical systems, forest systems, almost all of our native plant diversity is actually found in the forest understory. It's estimated to be about 80%, and so that's all the stuff that's growing like beneath our knees. And so if we care about something like native plant diversity, then what we really care about is a lot of these small herbaceous plants that we find growing on the forest understory. And one reason why I feel that these temperate forests, and specifically these wildflowers that we find in forests, might not be resilient to invasion and warming temperatures is because we have some evidence that native and invasive species in these systems are actually doing sort of fundamentally different things in terms of their phenological responses to warming. And so if you're a forest wildflower, light is one of the most limiting resources that you have in the forest understory. And so many of these wildflowers are actually exploiting this really critical light window in the early spring when the forest canopy, the trees haven't fully leafed out and they're maximizing their forest light. And there's been some estimates that some of these really early spring ephemerals are getting about 80% of their carbon budget for the year during this maybe 4-week period before when the wildflowers have emerged, but before the trees have leafed out. And so this is just like a wildflower's eye view. I think I took this picture in mid-March, right around this time in Pittsburgh, of what it looks like in the early spring and how much canopy light that you have coming in. And so to explain why I think invasive plants might reduce wildflower resilience in the forest, I'm going to return to these pictures that I showed you before. And so both these images were also taken in the early spring. And so not only are these images dominated by non-native invasive plant species, but really the only thing that we see that's green in the forest in May in Connecticut or April in Delaware are non-native invasive plant species. And that little call-out box that I have on the bottom right, those little white flowers are spring beauties, which are a really common early spring ephemeral, and they're being surrounded by all that celandine. There's like 3 spring beauties around all this celandine on the forest floor. And so we can see the other thing to notice in these pictures is not only does there seem to be this like distinct phenological signal of these invasive plants, but all the green arrows are pointing to species that are invasive shrubs. So invasive shrubs are a huge component of our eastern temperate deciduous forest. And so this is just another photo to show you the differences in spring leaf phenology of invasive shrubs, which are in the foreground of this picture. They're dark, they're green. Those leaves, that's a burning bush. They're fully expanded. They're as big as they're going to get for the year. And then in the background of the photo, we have a native shrub spice bush, really common across the eastern United States. It's light green because those leaves are so teeny tiny and little. And if we flip to go back and say, well, what does it look like for a wildflower, you can actually see that the early spring light window is really different for our native shrub species versus, this is taken on the same day in the same forest in Pittsburgh. So if you're a wildflower growing underneath a native species, you're getting a whole lot more light than if you're a wildflower growing under one of these non-native species where you have much more leaf expansion, much less light. And when you go out and you measure the light levels underneath these different types of shrubs, we can see that some shrubs are blocking almost 30% of the light during that extended light window. So this is like a significant amount of light that these early phenology shrubs are blocking. But what about climate warming? That seems to be just like a natural thing that's happening where these phenologies are different. But what is happening when plants are responding to climate change? And so one way to answer this question is go back and look at historical records like museum specimens to record what plants have been doing through time. And so what's cool about these historical specimens is that obviously they collect the plant, but they say the date and the location where they have collected it. And so we can go back and we can say, well, what was the plant doing on that date? Was it flowering? Did it have leaves? Was it fully emerged? Was it fruiting? Was it beyond that stage? And so using this data, this is about 300 observations of some common plants in southwestern Pennsylvania. Each of those points is one herbarium record where we can just say, look at the year, and looking at the fruiting time of, this is multiple species, we can just see that through time we are definitely seeing a clear signal where these species are advancing their phenology and having earlier than average fruiting in more recent times compared to past times. But we can also do more than just look at the year. We can actually match those years and collection dates to actual temperatures and what's happening in historical records. And so what I'm showing you now on the right is, instead of the year, I'm showing you a standardized temperature index, whether the year in which that herbarium specimen was collected was on average cooler or warmer than across the 100-year data set that we use to create this index. And we can see an even more interesting pattern emerging, which is that non-native plants actually seem to be responding differently to these same temperatures than our native plants. And so we see a much more significant decrease where these non-native plants are flowering earlier in warmer years relative to native plants, which really aren't showing that much of a signal. And so one question is like, well, why? Why would these non-native plants that are experiencing the same winter, spring temperatures, why are they experiencing a different, why are why is their phenology different than these native species where they're exposed to the same temperatures? And so one reason we might see this might actually have to do with where these species evolved and the environments in which they evolved. And so this is a really nice map that Konstantin Zoner put together showing the difference, and it's really nice to sometimes present this in springtime where multiple people have told me how weird the weather has been here this week. But what it's actually doing is what we know about spring times in eastern North America is that we have really high variation in spring temperatures. And so this map is just showing standard deviation of average spring temperatures March through May for each of the pixels on the map. And the warmer, like red and yellow areas are places where we get these high fluctuations where it literally snowed on us last night and now it's 50 degrees today. And that happens all the time across eastern North America. But what you can see is that's not the case for all temperate forest ecosystems. And so the two places where most of our invasive species are coming from, especially our shrubs, are Western Europe and Eastern Asia, where there's actually very low variation in spring temperatures. And so what that means is that these plants that we've introduced to Eastern North America evolved in these climates where spring warming was a really reliable cue for phenology. Whereas our North American plants have evolved in a location where spring temperature is not a reliable cue because it might be warm for this week, but we're going to get a cold snap next week. And so maybe spring temperature signals the plants aren't responding because of that evolutionary history. But native and invasive plants aren't the only sort of like functional groups in our forest that are responding differently to temperatures. And so Ben Lee, I had the privilege of working with, I know was with Inez and working here, came and worked with me and my colleague Mason Heberlein at the Carnegie Museum of Natural History. And what Ben did as part of his postdoc was we gave him a whole bucket load of herbarium data, but this time instead of looking at invasive and native species, we were interested in how wildflowers were responding through time relative to tree species. And so we had herbarium records of both trees and wildflowers collected in Eastern Asia, Western Europe, and here in Eastern North America. And what we saw was this really clear signal that something is happening in North America relative to these other continents, perhaps because of that high spring variation, but also that trees seem to be responding more to spring temperature. So per degree Celsius, our trees are leafing out, their early season phenology is happening sooner than our forest wildflowers, taking it apart. And so we also have this like separation where it seems like these different functional forms in our forest are also responding differently to climate change. And so one reason we might see these different phenological responses between woody shrubs and herbaceous wildflowers might be that these plants are actually experiencing different temperature environments even though they're physically in the same place. And so if you're a woody tree or a shrub, your leaf buds are exposed to air temperatures throughout all of winter and spring. But if you're a wildflower, you're mostly exhibiting maybe at the soil surface or your root systems are below ground. So you're actually experiencing that soil environment. And so you can see if you just go out and we did some temperature monitoring stations in the forest where we measured soil temperatures, surface temperatures, and up in the tree canopy temperatures, you can see that there's a lot of variation between below ground temperatures and then tree canopy temperatures, and sort of two important points, which is that air temperatures are really highly fluctuating. That's the blue line in the graph. And soil temperatures seem to be more stable. But also that our tree canopies are experiencing colder temperatures sooner in the winter because they don't have that specific mass and specific heat of the soil that's keeping the soil warmer for longer. And so winter chilling and spring warming are both important phenological cues that these plants are cueing into. But our wildflowers and our woody plants might be experiencing different cues, and that might be causing different responses too as the climate warms. And so we were interested in testing these ideas directly by doing some experimental treatments. And so what we did is we went out into the forest and we tagged about 15 different species of both native and invasive trees and shrubs that were common in this forest. And then we also we purchased mature wildflowers that we planted directly into the forest, into these common gardens. And then we went out at 2 time points in the winter, once in January and once in February, to simulate a shorter, warmer winter with our January collection or a longer, cooler winter with our February collection. And we collected these plants and we brought them back to the University of Pittsburgh, where we put them in growth chambers where we could then simulate spring warming. And we put them at either an ambient spring temperature for the time of year for May, or we ramped up the temperatures by 5 degrees Celsius to see how quickly these plants would respond to that spring warming signal. And so using these experiments, we can now test directly how different functional groups like trees, shrubs, and wildflowers, and also native and non-native species, are differing in their temperature sensitivity, either to the effects of spring warming, either a warm winter spring warming, I have these backwards. Spring warming, either a warm spring or an ambient spring, or effects of winter warming, a warm winter or a cool winter. And so here what I'm going to plot for you is the relative effect of these different temperature cues. The colors are correct, the words are not above them, for all these different functional forms in native and invasive species. And so, for example, from these experiments, we can see really clearly from these plots, from trends like native shrubs with these 2 blue dots, were very sensitive to winter chilling, regardless of the warming treatment. So they really needed that winter chilling, but didn't differ that much whether we put them in a warm or an ambient spring temperature. And we found that they were much less sensitive to spring warming compared to winter chilling. We really didn't see any effect at all. And so coming back to this first hypothesis that non-native plants should be more sensitive to spring warming than natives, we found weak support for this. So we saw a little bit with our non-native shrubs, and we had one non-native wildflower, that Ficaria verna, that seemed to be showing stronger trends, but they weren't showing really strong trends relative to our native species. We did see a bit more support for our second hypothesis that woody plants, with the exception of those non-native shrubs, were more responsive to winter chilling than our wildflowers. So we saw that those winter chilling effects were sort of across the board more important for those trees and shrubs relative to the wildflowers. But coming back to our forest wildflowers, we might want to know what's going to happen as our winters and our springs are warming, which is what is anticipated to happen for a lot of the eastern United States. And so in our experiments, we actually found no phenological response of those native wildflowers to spring warming. So they were not picking up those warming signals when we put them into the growth chamber. But in contrast, when we look at all those plant species that are growing above them, they're all advancing their phenology relative. And so if wildflowers are actually, on average, less likely to advance their warming as our springs warm and our winters warm, then that light window that they're experiencing is going to continue to close, and they're going to have less time to do a lot of the photosynthetic carbon accumulation that they need to do within the forest. And so this is just another signal that we might need to worry about forest diversity in response to not just invasion, but also climate warming. And so while these herbarium records and these experimental studies imply that the presence of invasive shrubs and warming temperatures are going to change those early light environments, and it might actually lead to repercussions for the fitness and the continuity of these native plant populations in the forest, I think the jury is still out on what we're going to see. But luckily we have a field experiment that I'm watching Emma here. Her responses are so amazing. We are in year 5 of a shading experiment where we set up a bunch of common gardens around Pittsburgh, where we have 25 different native plant species, and we're imposing these experimental shading treatments for us to be able to test in real time what are the phenological and physiological and plant community composition treatments of what could be happening as we both get earlier shading as that canopy closes with warming, but also denser shading with those invasive shrubs. And so I'm really excited that Olivia is going to come join me at Yale in the fall, and we're really hoping that we can just dump a bucket load of data on her from 5 years from this experimental treatment to help us work through this and see if some of the things that we've seen in our herbarium studies and our experimental studies are panning out in actual forest ecosystems. So in conclusion, I hope that I've shown you that the interactions between shrub invasion and warming temperatures may have these long-term fitness results, and you all will have to invite Olivia back here in a couple years to see whether we're actually seeing this play out on the ground in these experiments. So moving on now really quickly to just a final area. This is like a new area of research that I just wanted to touch on briefly because it's some of the work that I've transitioned to and thinking about forest management and resilience for something that people care a lot about right now and are actually putting a lot of funding into, which is managing forests for specifically carbon sequestration and storage as a climate mitigation tool. And so broadly, these questions are sort of two main ways that we can go about asking questions about how should we be managing forests across these landscapes to sequester and store more carbon. One is relatively fast. We can use these projection models that we can project what might happen under these future research conditions. And the other is embedding our research into actual experiments in real time and what's happening. And these two different approaches have a lot of trade-offs. Projection models are really quick and easy to run. You just need some forest inventory data, but they come with a lot of assumptions that we have to embed into the model of like, what do we think we're going to see in the future? Are plants going to grow at the same rate that they've been growing before? And we have to wash away a lot of that ecological complexity. Empirical measurements are really hard to do, and forests grow really slowly. And so these empirical measurements are really important to track what's happening on the ground in real time, but they're not going to give us the answers as fast as we might want to inform policy or people who want to make decisions today. And so I'm going to share a little bit about some projection models that we've done in our lab group, but I just want to emphasize that you really can't get away from empirical measurements as being a really important tool for understanding this as well. And so recently, I led a study that was part of this larger collaborative effort. The Biden administration was really interested in carbon dioxide removal and how the United States could use different approaches to actually remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and store it to help address climate mitigation. Where Lou was a postdoc working with me at Yale, and we led a study looking at forest management specifically for the United States for carbon dioxide removal. And Where specifically was interested in honing in on forest management in southern New England to understand what are our options for managing forest carbon in southern New England. And so we started out with just a bunch of forest inventory points, which are all those black and gray dots that you can probably barely see on there, of current forest composition in the region. And we used the US Forest Service forest vegetation simulator model to simulate what could happen under different management scenarios, but also different climate disturbance scenarios to see what might be the most the best way to manage our forest ecosystems. And so we specifically looked at 3 different climate disturbance scenarios. We looked at a no disturbance scenario, so we just assumed the forests were going to grow. There was going to be no other than natural mortality and death that we see in the forest. The trees would just grow and replace one another. We had an extreme weather scenario where we simulated extreme drought every 10 years, which is becoming more common in our region, and one major windstorm event like a hurricane or a blowdown, a microburst blowdown that would kill a lot of the larger mature trees in the forest. And then we did a climate scenario of extreme weather plus pests and pathogens. And so we have a series of pests and pathogens that I think some of you have here: emerald ash borer and hemlock woolly adelgid, and beech leaf and beech bark disease, which are hitting our forest really hard right now, that are causing specific mortality of some of the dominant trees that we see in our forest. And then we looked at 3 different management options. And this, at the time that we did this study, this was really interesting because the state of Massachusetts, the new governor that came in, actually put a moratorium on all harvesting on state lands because the state was really interested in what they should do for managing forest lands. And there was a whole component of folks who thought the best thing to do was to just stop harvesting state lands and just let the trees grow. And there was a whole group of folks who said, no, that's not going to lead to climate resilience. What we really need to do is probably do some sustainable harvest scenarios where we actually try to sort of move and push these systems into more diverse, more resilient systems. Unfortunately, what we see on the landscape are not sustainable harvest scenarios, but are what we're calling here exploitation harvest scenarios, which is where you go maximize your short-term economic gains on the forest. So you basically cut out all your big trees, you leave all the scraggly ones, and you end up with what foresters would call a more degraded forest. forest. And so we use this model to test how these different climate scenarios and disturbances interacted with these different management scenarios to say if we wanted to store the most amount of carbon or have the most carbon resiliency on the landscape, what would we do? And so I'll walk you through this graph really quickly. We were able to model out about 100 years with our model. So years is on the x-axis. We have carbon storage just in terms of tons of carbon per hectare. The output of this model gives us carbon stocks in these various carbon pools that include living above ground tree biomass, below ground tree biomass, fallen dead trees, and then living in dead tree roots. So the different colors that I show you are going to represent those different carbon pools. And so what do we find when we model out these scenarios? So we find in this like optimistic future where there's no climate disturbances whatsoever, we find a lot of evidence that yes, the no harvest scenario, like what the governor of Massachusetts decided to do, is going to keep carbon stocks the highest over the longest period of time. We also see that, making a lot of assumptions about how trees grow and how they'll respond to sustainable harvest, that after a 100-year period, though, we do see in the sustainable harvest scenario that carbon stocks have rebounded to about 92% of the carbon stock that we saw under the no harvest, no disturbance scenario. But what's problematic with studies like this, which a lot of studies do this, they don't include disturbances in their models, is that this is highly unlikely. We already have these pest and pathogens in our systems. We're already seeing changing climate events, late season droughts. And so this doesn't really give us a complete picture about what to expect on the scenario. And so if we then go ahead and look and say, well, what's happening with our extreme weather events, our extreme weather pests and pathogen events, you can see we get an entirely different picture. And so those red lines are showing what the carbon stocks are under a no disturbance, no harvest scenario. But you can see just by implementing these climate disturbances, we're seeing huge decreases in the amount of carbon projected for the landscape, over half to 60% with our sort of most extreme scenario. But what I think is interesting is when we start to look at the interactions between these management harvest options that foresters are talking about, especially these sustainable harvest options and extreme weather events, we actually start to see some more hopeful pictures that management may be able to manage these forested ecosystems in ways that allows them to not have as much carbon stock as under the no disturbance scenarios, but at least rebuild those carbon stocks. And so now I'm showing you on the red line the curve of what happens under no harvest scenarios with this extreme weather and extreme weather pest and pathogen events. And we can see that we have about 36% more carbon, or that's not quite 25%, it's like 20% more carbon when we use these sustainable harvest scenarios at the end of the 100-year period. And so coming back to these resilience diagrams one last time, we can show that while these modeled disturbances do reduce forest stocks, management might actually be able to regain more forest stocks than what we would have under a no management scenario. And so using these modeling projections is really nice because it gives us these big picture ideas of what could happen under all these assumptions. But I just really want to emphasize that we also need to be tracking these sort of climate smart forestry metrics on the ground. And so I'm building out relationships with groups like the New England Forestry Foundation, which has a lot of funding right now to actually go implement some of these. They're not allowed to call it climate smart forestry practices. They are advancing market productivity, but are going to go out on the landscape and start implementing these. And so we're working closely with these groups to see if we can embed some of our monitoring and ecological experiment to actually track what's happening in response in real time. And so just to close out this section, I hope I've shown that there is some utility in these forecasting models about what will happen, but hopefully we can continue to monitor and see what makes forest resilience in the future. And so in conclusion, I just hope I've showed you that these ecological questions of understanding the basic ecology can really help us understand why forests are responding in the way they're forests, and maybe even provide some insight of how we can change our management. I've shown you that sometimes we might need more ecological research to understand what's going on, like with the invasion patterns or with this phenology pattern, but also that we can sometimes get these restored forests or at least build resiliency in the systems. And I just want to end by saying, like, all the stuff that I've shown you have basically shown that forests aren't very resilient, and that's because those are the interesting places where we need a lot of work. But I don't actually want to leave you with this sort of vulnerability discourse that these systems are, going to completely collapse and fall apart under this invasion. I do have a lot of evidence where I got null results, meaning that the invader impact dissipated through time, or it didn't have as large of an impact on the ecosystem that we expected to see. And so we actually do see incredible resiliency in these forests under certain scenarios. I'm just not presenting that data today. So that is it. Oh, no, my shameless promotion. So Amy mentioned I'm transitioning from a research scientist position to an assistant professor position, still at the Yale School of Forestry and staying in place, but I am going to ramp up hiring. So this is mostly for students in the room. I'm anticipating taking on graduate students, master's and PhD students, postdocs, and also looking for a field lab manager. So if you think you might want to go see really sad dying beech trees in southern New England and join me to do some research, please do come say hi or get my contact information from Olivia or Nate or Amy, because I'm building up a lab starting very shortly. And so that is all now. Happy to take some questions with the remaining time that we have.
Questions?
Oh, that's bizarre.
Yeah, way over in the far right.
Thanks for that great talk. So the modeling effort was just carbon stocks. What about sequestration?
Yeah, I mean, so those are, the FVS is just a growth and yield model. So it's just growing the trees out through time. So the sequestration would have just been the increase, like the area under the curve, like the relative change under the curve as the forests are growing.
Does the model then take into account the size structure, right? So you have...
It takes into account the age structure and the size structure, and then it's using Forest Service, forest inventory and analysis data to populate the growth of individual tree species based on the density in the forest and their projected growth rates through time.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Yeah.
Others? Yeah.
Hi, Sarah. Thank you. Great talk. I was thinking, I don't know if it's working. Is it working? Okay, thank you. I was thinking about your result, the meta-analysis result about the native plants' effect on non-native plants. You showed to us that sometimes the native have positive effects, and other times they have negative effects. I was thinking about if you could subset these native plants on groups of, for example, if they have similar traits with the non-native plants.
Yeah.
For example, if they have different dispersal modes, because I think that if they have similar traits, they should compete, and instead of if they have different traits, perhaps the results are positive.
Yeah, no, and we actually used some of this data in another meta-analysis where we looked at the different functional forms, and now I can't remember. The people don't tend to measure the impacts of native plants on non-native plants. They measure the opposite. They'll just measure the impacts, or they'll design their studies. So if I could flip back, but the sample size is much lower, which also could explain why it didn't have a statistically significant effect, just because people don't measure that as much. So you're probably right that the different treatments and nitrogen fixers really matter. That was the main functional form where you started seeing deviations of whether the competitor was a nitrogen fixer or not. But I don't think we have enough statistical power to test that idea, because people are less likely to measure the impacts. But yeah, it's a really good point.
Any last questions for Sarah? If not, Sarah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Nate.
Oh, there's one.
One more.
I'm sorry.
Oh, that's okay.
I was actually looking at this right here, and I was wondering why, after 100 years for the no harvest